Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Kalpna Patel, Product Coordinator at BookNet, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Lily Dwyer, Product Manager. Welcome to our webinar on the rise, book subjects on the move in the Canadian market. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you're joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all of that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. For our webinar today, if you're having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in the chat or email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the Show Captions button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have any questions for us, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please be kind and respectful. Please do not record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy for violations of our Code of Conduct, so please report any harassment to the Tech Forum team. Now, let's get started. We've got lots of fun things to talk about today. And as I mentioned, there will be time for questions at the end of the session. But just to make sure everyone gets the most out of that Q&A time, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping and go over the scope and parameters of today's presentation. All of the data presented to you today is collected from our SalesData retailer aggregation service, which we estimate represents approximately 85% of the sales for English language print trade books. This means we'll be looking specifically at the sales of print books measured in units sold and not at ebooks or audiobooks. For the most part, we'll be comparing sales in the all markets for 2024 over 2023, except in a few instances where we will go back as far as 5 years to get a wider look at growth and trends year over year. We will not be comparing sales in chain stores to independent retailers, but rather looking at trends and subject market shares across all the retailers that report their sales to SalesData and what we refer to as the all market. The subject headings and categories we're going to refer to today are based on BISAC subjects, except in a few instances where a BISAC code doesn't currently exist for the books and topics we're interested in which case we'll be sure to outline which codes we've sort of mashed together when considering particular genres and trends. Throughout the presentation, we'll also talk about some of the new subject codes introduced in the latest BISAC code release. Nothing excites us more than standards and updates to those standards, and the release of new subject codes alerts us to new developments in the publishing and book buying world. Code changes and additions are meant to not only meet the needs of the industry, but to ultimately aid in the discoverability of books. They help retailers sell books, and more importantly, they help readers find books. So in many cases, a new code tells us that something interesting is going on in that subject that deserves our attention. Finally, all of the market research and reports we've run to present these findings to you were pulled using SalesData and LibraryData, which are tools that all subscribers have access to. This means that as far as the data goes, all of the information we present today is available at your fingertips. And if you're not a subscriber, you should definitely stick around until the end of the session to learn about the other tools and resources available to you.
So, hi, everyone. Like Kalpna said, all of the research and reports that we've run to present these findings to you today were created through the SalesData and LibraryData tools. So from SalesData, we used a couple of reports. First, we used the market share report to identify which subjects underwent significant growth or decline over the past couple of years. So if you're not aware of it, the market share report is really useful because it lets you calculate percentages of publisher, distributor, imprint, subject, and format sales in the all markets aggregate. So again, that's across all the retailers that are reporting into SalesData. And then you can compare those percentages over different periods of time. So unlike some of our other reports that examine more title level data, a market share report takes a more zoomed out approach and lets you look at overall trends in the market. So whether those are subject trends, format trends, or publisher trends. And then once we identified what our top trending subjects were, we used the bestseller report in SalesData to see what titles were actually driving those sales. And if you're unfamiliar with it, the bestseller report lets you pull a list of the top titles within a given reporting period that is ranked by units sold. So for this presentation, we pulled bestseller reports for 2024 using the BISAC subject filter. And that BISAC subject filter would be set to whatever our identified trending subject was. And this would help us determine if those sales were driven by one or two highly popular books or from a larger list of titles. And for this presentation, sort of for the first time, we were also interested in finding out what were the top circulated titles at libraries for the same popular subjects as they were in the retail space in 2024. So to pull that information, we used the popular books report in LibraryData. And this report is a bit similar to the bestseller report in that it lets you pull the top titles that are circulating in libraries. And then that's ranked either by the number of loans, holds to copies ratio, renewals, or on order copies. So yes, all of the data that we're going to go over today are things that you can pull in SalesData and LibraryData yourself if you're a subscriber.
All right, so now that you know where the data comes from, let's dive into it. We'll start with a quick roundup of 2024's market performance. Unfortunately, the decline we've been seeing in sales for print books since 2021 continued last year, where sales were down just under 4% from 2023. This downward trend could be seen across all top level subjects, with the exception of adult fiction, which was up just a teeny bit, about 1% over 2023. So thank you for that, Kristen Hanna and Rebecca Yaros. In looking at subject trends for last year, we of course have to consider cultural, structural, and economic shifts affecting book buying behavior. So we're not showing you this sad graph to bum you out, but just to provide some context for the numbers you'll see throughout the presentation. And in addition to looking at which subject sales increased last year, we'll also revisit some of the trends and discussion topics from our Trending Now session back in February of 2024, and see if those spikes have continued to stay sharp or if sales have dulled down. As we explore all the branches and buds of the BISAC tree, we'll of course be looking at subjects with the highest sales and library loans, but also those subheadings and categories that might not have super high units sold, but where the sales have increased dramatically over the past year, which is what fires up our trend spotting neurons. So now we'll get to the books. Travel books are a hot topic in this annual presentation, mostly because we've been monitoring sales since they took such a huge hit during the pandemic. So we're going to take a look at what happened in the world of travel, in the actual world, and in the retail world, and see how those behavioral and book buying trends might extend to other categories and genres. Overall, sales in nonfiction travel category were flat across 2024 and 2023. So sales are still down from 2022, but haven't increased or decreased much at all in the last year. Looking at the top performing subjects within travel, however, we see big increases in the special interest and Asia subcategories. Sales of titles under special interest rose by 26%, and those under the Asia subheading rose by 30%. But before we jump into those sales bumps, we're going to take a quick look at what was going on with travel books in libraries across Canada. Subjects with the highest loan counts in 2024 are shown here in this graph, with titles in the Europe and Canada categories making up most of the travel book loans, followed by the United States, Asia, and Italy. The titles with the highest loans are mostly within the Europe category. One thing I should point out about this graph, and that you'll see in other graphs throughout the presentation, is that purple other slice. This portion refers to all the other subheadings associated with the subject. So in this case, other refers to all of the travel book categories not represented by the rest of the pie. In this graph specifically, we can see that titles in the Europe and Canada categories made up just more than half of all the travel book loans in Canadian libraries. So now we'll jump back over to sales data and take a look at those sales bumps. In 2024, we saw a 26% increase in the special interest category. Most of those sales were for books in the adventure and hikes and walks subcategories. And here you can see some of the top selling special interest travel titles, many of which look like really great gift or coffee table books, especially those top three in particular. And when we looked at the weekly sales breakdown for those top three titles, sure enough, the data shows that outside of the initial weeks following release, all three titles saw a significant sales jump in that magical week 51 of 2024. We'll move now from travel book buying trends to actual travel trends here for a second. According to Statistic Canada's year in review, Canadian resident trips abroad continued their upward trend last year, surpassing their 2023 level by 10% and totaling 93% of the 2019 level. Canadian resident trips to the United States totaled 39 million. And while those trips were up 4% from 2023, they were still only 89% of the 2019 level. In contrast, trips overseas by Canadian residents surpassed the pre-pandemic level for the first time in 2024. So up 5% from 2019 and rising about 31% from 2023. So the fact that more Canadians are taking overseas and international trips is clearly reflected in the other travel book sales bumps we saw last year. Sales of books in the Asia category increased 30% last year, and digging deeper into all the Asia subcategories like Asia General, East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, India, and South Asia, we actually saw an increase in sales in every single one of those subcategories. And of those categories, Japan saw a 30% increase and had the second highest units sold next to the broader East Asia category. And it makes sense that sales of travel books about Japan have increased because basically everyone went to Japan last year. An article in the Japan Times from June of last year states that Japan has never seen so many tourists flood into the country so quickly. The article continues to explain that the yen's collapse, which meant a cheaper traveling experience for those with tourist dollars to spend, coupled with the post-pandemic surge in global tourism, has sparked interest in the nation like never before. More than 17 people arrived in the country in the first half of 2024, according to the Japan National Tourism Organization's latest figures, and that's 70% up on the same period last year and on track to beat 2019's record 31 million visitors. It'll be interesting to see if this upward trend continues this year and how that might be reflected in travel book sales. Here we have some of the top selling travel titles of 2024, where Lonely Planet Japan has taken the #2 spot. And you can also see that two of the top selling special interest titles, the National Geographic Bucket List and 40 Days and 40 Hikes, are also among the highest selling travel books overall, not just in the special interest category. And since we're always interested in how social and behavioral trends translate into book buying and reading trends, the obvious question would be whether the increased travel in Japan extends to reading about Japan. And the obvious answer is yes. For a few years now, we've seen the incredible success of Toshikazu Kawaguchi's Before the Coffee Gets Cold series, and other novels that have a bookstore, library, coffee shop, cat theme out of Korea and Japan. And the trend extends beyond North America. Another article published in The Guardian states that in 2022, figures from Nielsen Bookscan showed that Japanese fiction represented 25% of all translated fiction sales in the UK. And that dominance is even more striking this year. Figures obtained by The Guardian show that of the top 40 translated fictions titles for 2024, so far 43% are Japanese. Another article in the New York Times states that these titles belong, whoops, oh, skipped ahead a slide. Let's see. Well, you don't necessarily have to see this slide, so I can continue telling you about the New York Times article that I read. So the New York Times article refers to these books as genre, or this genre called healing fiction, which are cozy, feel-good novels that have long been popular in Japan and Korea and are now catching on in translation around the world. In the United States and England, where Kawaguchi's series has sold more than 3 million copies, publishers have released dozens of healing novels in translation and are rushing to acquire more. The article continues to say that some publishers compared the surging interest in healing fiction to the explosion in Scandinavian noir that followed the success of Stieg Larsson's Millennium trilogy more than a decade ago. Unfortunately, there is no BISAC code for healing fiction yet, so we don't have the data to back up this observation here in Canada. But the phenomenon did inspire us to look at the Asian American and Pacific Islander subheading in fiction and the Japan subheading under world literature. In both cases, we see a big increase in sales of AAPI titles and a steady increase over the last 5 years in sales of world literature Japan titles. Here are the books that account for a large portion of the sales increase of AAPI classified titles in 2024. Half of these top sellers are by Asian Canadian authors. So A Great Country, Denison Avenue, A Tale for the Time Being, Batshit 7, and Silver Repetition. And now here we have the top selling titles in the World Literature Japan category, which are all works translated from the Japanese. The works of Osamu Dazai dominates this category, in part due to some very handsome reissues by New Directions, who have also reissued his title No One Knows earlier this year. And two new translations are due out this May to coincide with AAPI month. A new translation of The Setting Sun by Tuttle Publishing, and a Penguin Classics Deluxe edition of his most well-known work, No Longer Human. So based on past sales history, we expect that these forthcoming translations will further increase the growth of this world literature subcategory into 2025. And I am afraid I'll have to take back what I said about there not being a BISAC code for healing fiction, sort of. With the new 2024 BISAC subject code release, we now have a subheading under fiction for books, bookstores, and libraries, which could theoretically capture a good chunk of those novels we looked at earlier. And as this code becomes populated, it'll be interesting to see how many titles are works translated from the Japanese and Korean, and whether we'll be able to get some data-driven insights into at least a portion of healing fiction sales.
Okay, so now we're going to go into some genre fiction trends, starting off with what's happening in the world of romance. And on that note, you didn't think that we'd get through this presentation without actually mentioning Romantasy, did you? So we talked about this a lot in last year's presentation, 2023 was the first year where we really noticed the astounding growth of romantasy titles in the book market. And these are books with, of course, blends of both romance and fantasy in their subject material. So readers can get their typical favorite romance tropes, such as enemies to lovers or love triangles and fated soulmates, but with elements of fantasy, such as fae people, dragons, and magic systems. And we think a lot of this has to do with readers' desire for escapism, whether it's adults who are returning to the genres that comforted them in their teenage years, so people who read like the Twilight books or the Hunger Games, but also it could be reaching readers who are hearing about these types of books for the first time through its booming popularity on Book Talk. And when looking at this growth in the data, there's no actual BISAC code for romantasy, so we looked at the following headings. Romance as a subheading within the fiction fantasy category, fantasy as a subheading within the fiction romance category, and then romance within the young adult fantasy category. And as you can see in the chart on your screen, we can see that these BISAC codes not only continued to grow in popularity in 2024, but they grew significantly. So fantasy romance grew by 82%, romance fantasy grew by 175%, and then YA fantasy romance grew by 101%. So that just keeps on growing and it doesn't seem to show signs of stopping. And as you can see here are some of the top selling titles that make up each of those categories. So for romance and fantasy, we have Phantasma, Quicksilver, A Touch of Darkness, A Soul of Ash and Blood. So there's a lot of 2024 books in there that are also mixed in with a couple of backlist titles as well. And then for fantasy romance, this is where we can see some of those slightly older favorites. So we have Sarah J. Maas's series, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and the Throne of Glass series, as well as her 2024 House of Flame and Shadow, and also Rebecca Yarros's Fourth Wing. So you can see that this genre in particular is really heavily dominated by just those two authors. And then for YA fantasy romance, again, these are very heavily dominated by the same authors in their book series. For instance, we have Lauren Robert and her Powerless series, Rebecca Ross and Divine Rivals, as well as Stephanie Garber, Once Upon a Broken Heart series. So that's what's going on in the retail market. But we were also interested in seeing if these same books were popular in libraries. So here are some of the top performing titles in libraries for the same subjects in 2024. And once again, we have A Court of Thorns and Roses and Throne of Glass, Fourth Wing, and some of the same YA titles like Divine Rivals and Powerless. So this is one subject area in particular where we can see that titles that are dominating book sales in a given subject area are also experiencing the same popularity with library patrons. So all in all, 2024 continued to be a smashing success for romantasy titles, and it will be interesting to see if the same trend continues for 2025. Okay, so now we're going to zoom out a bit and we're going to look at other popular subjects within romance besides romantasy. With libraries specifically, when we look at the most popular romance subgenres, we notice that while the same romantasy books in the retail market are also popular in libraries, romantasy as a subgenre doesn't even appear in the top 10. So here you can see that the top subgenres of romance for libraries in 2024 were contemporary romance, romantic comedy, suspense, historical regency, and new adult. So you can see that the library patrons are taking out books and subjects that dominated romance in our subject trends presentations in previous years. And in terms of what the top borrowed titles are for these categories, so for contemporary romance, we have Meet Me at the Lake. For romantic comedy, I think all of Emily Henry's books appeared in here, like Happy Place. For romance suspense, there's Nora Roberts' Inheritance. Historical regions, the Bridgerton books are still quite popular in libraries. And for new adult, we have the Hating Game, which is another favorite, more backlist title.
Aside from the increasing popularity of romantasy titles that Lily just described, we'll now take a look at some other romance subcategories that saw fairly large sales bumps in the last year. Subjects with the highest sales increases over 2023 include new adult, paranormal, holiday, workplace, and sports romances. But the data shows that for these top selling subcategories, the sales usually consist of works by a single author or a single title or series. For example, Laurie Gilmore's The Christmas Tree Farm accounts for 21% of the romance holiday sales bump, and her Pumpkin Spice Cafe accounts for 39% of the romance workplace sales. Anna Huang's Twisted series, which we just saw, also had some of the highest library loans last year, also crushed it on the retail side of things, accounting for 31% of the new adult sales. And Allie Hazelwood's Not in Love accounts for 37% of romance workplace sales, while Bride accounts for more than half of the sales of paranormal romance in 2024. But let's stop right here for a second and take a closer look at this paranormal category. Though sales were dominated by a single Allie Hazelwood title last year, overall, paranormal sales were slightly above historical romance sales, which has always been a top performing category with significantly more ISBNs than those assigned to the paranormal subject code. So it's interesting that many of the dark romances trending on TikTok, like the Harvey LaRue series, can be found in this category, which suggests a continued interest and popularity in paranormal romance. Also of interest is the fact that aside from historical and LGBTQ plus romance subjects, paranormal is the only other one that branches out even wider on the BISAC tree, with subheadings for shifters, vampires, and witches. This graph shows how those paranormal sales were distributed across these subcategories last year. Sadly, however, no demon sales were reported, so who knows, maybe next year. Before we finish up with romance, let's also take a look at that 1,039% increase in sports romance titles. According to the data, Canadian Bal Cabra's Collide made up 28% of those sales. But a lot of the other top selling titles also have something in common. Ice hockey was certainly hot in 2024. 7 of those top 10 titles in the sports romance category are hockey related. And it only makes sense that the top 2 titles are Canadian. So are shapeshifters and hockey players the new heroes of romance? Or will these forthcoming titles, a different sport themed romance, going to make hockey books take the back seat? You can bet we are going to monitor those sales to find out. Up next, we're going to continue to review one of last year's subject trends findings, where we looked at particular subcategory sales under adult health and fitness. In last year's presentation, we took a close look at sales in the women's health and menopause categories. A study published by StatsCan last year showed that millennials had officially outnumbered the boomer population, so those aged 60 to 78 in Canada. And according to BookNet's Canadian Book Consumer Survey, we know that those millennials, as well as young Gen Xers, so people aged 35 to 44, buy the most print books. So the 32% increase in menopause books sales that we saw in 2023 makes sense, given this shift in demographics and increased population of potentially perimenopausal book buyers. And while we're not in the business of predicting trends, we are by nature numbers people that rely on data, which can only reveal the workings of the past. We did have an inkling that the demand for books about menopause would continue to increase. And the 1,112% increase in sales in 2024 shows us that we weren't wrong. It is important to note, however, that almost 80% of those sales could be attributed to a single book, and that's Mary Claire Haver's The New Menopause, which was popular among both book buyers and borrowers. In fact, there's quite a bit of overlap between the top 5 selling and top 5 borrowed titles in this category. The Menopause Brain and Estrogen Matters also appear at the top of both of these lists last year. Often, when we see an increase in subject sales driven by a single title, we don't typically call that a trend since it could just be a one off. Something to keep in mind, though, is that while a single book is making up most of these menopause sales, there are a number of other top selling menopause books that are not included in the units sold and then the data we just showed you. And that's because they have a different BISAC subject code. So, for example, there are titles in the medical gynecology category, including Jen Gunter's Menopause Manifesto, as well as in the more general women's health category that are about menopause, but aren't classified as such in the metadata. And therefore, those titles don't show up in our market share and bestseller reports for the menopause subject. So the overall units sold in this category is actually much higher than the data shows. But I think we can remain confident that our findings in 2023 continue to be valid in 2024. After reviewing the data and diving deeper into the women's health subject, we were armed with enough information and evidence to present a case for the addition of a few new subject codes. Based on our research for this same presentation last year, we managed to get the BISAC subject working group to review and report our recommendation to add new codes for menstruation and reproductive health to the BISAC Subject Codes Committee. We are pretty happy to report that those recommendations were approved and the codes were included in the latest BISAC code release and can now be found under the Nonfiction Health and Fitness heading. Good for us. The increased demand of menopause titles in 2023 also encouraged us to look at health and fitness books for young people. Again, this demographic shift that I mentioned earlier meant that a significant number of active book buyers might also be the parents and caregivers of adolescents navigating puberty. Unfortunately, there was no code for puberty, so we looked at the maturing subheading found under the health and daily living subject, under both juvenile and young adult levels. But of course, we were unable to pull data specifically related to puberty and sex ed books. Revisiting the maturing subject this year, we saw a 28% increase in sales over 2023. Here are some of 2024's top selling titles in this category, which include books that might benefit from a more specific puberty subject classification rather than the more broad maturing. Books like Puberty is Gross, but also really awesome, and the period book, for example. Another thing to note is that with the latest 2024 BISAC refresh, maturing can now be found as its own heading under juvenile and young adult nonfiction, and no longer as a subheading of health and daily living. And there's a pretty good reason for this. And that's because we also advocated for a new code for puberty. Yes, we included this in our recommendation as well to the BISAC committee last year. And the subject can now be found under the health and daily living heading at both the juvenile and young adult level. So thank you to everyone in the BISAC working group for listening to us and helping us get these very important books accurately classified and into the hands of the readers who need them.
Okay, so now let's take a look at comics and graphic novels, which is another subject that we like to keep an eye on every year. So in previous years, we noticed that there was a steady incline in sales for comics and graphic novel titles, particularly with adult titles. So as you can see, that growth was pretty reliant between 2020 and 2022. And then 2023 was the first year that we started to see declines in that category. And the graph you see here outlines this well. So what we're looking at here is sales for comics and graphic novels for adult, juvenile, and YA books. So the adult data is pulling from titles that use the BISAC code for nonfiction comics and graphic novels. The juvenile data is pulling from titles that use two BISAC codes, juvenile nonfiction comics and graphic novels, and juvenile fiction comics and graphic novels. And then the YA data is also pulling from two BISAC codes, YA nonfiction, and YA fiction comics and graphic novels. So looking at all of those BISACs, you can see that comics and graphic novels continued to decline a bit in 2024, with the exception of juvenile books. Those did continue to grow. So adult titles went down by 9%. And you can see that those numbers are still pretty significant, but they did decrease year over year in 2024. YA titles went down by 23%, and juvenile titles increased by 6%. Now, if we wanted to dig into comics and graphic novels a little further, it's significant to note that manga books actually make up a large portion of those sales, particularly when looking at adult titles. And in 2024, titles associated with the BISAC code, comics and graphic novels, East Asian style manga general, was the second highest selling BISAC code for 2024 with 1.2 million units sold. So that's about 62% of sales for adult comics and graphic titles in that manga BISAC alone. So on this graph, you can see that manga books had similar trends in 2024, with adult manga titles decreasing by 11%, YA manga titles also decreasing a bit by 8%, and then juvenile manga titles had the same sort of growth at an 8% increase. And if you're interested in knowing what the top selling and top borrowed titles are for these subjects in 2024, so for adult comics, we have some books from different series like the Berserk series. For libraries, we have the Naruto series and the Demon Slayer series. For juvenile, we have in bookstores, the top selling titles were the Dogman series, the Babysitter's Club graphic series, and the Wings of Fire series. While in libraries, we saw a lot of these same series with the addition of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid and the Big Nate series. And then for YA comics and graphic novels in bookstores, we were seeing Heartstopper, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Spider-Man. And then in libraries, again, there was a lot of overlap, but with libraries, we were also seeing the Magical Boy series as well. Okay. So now that we've had some more lighthearted fun, let's move on to some horror. And horror is another fiction genre that has seen some increase in sales in recent years. So here you can see that there has been some steady growth in horror since 2020, with the most significant growth taking place in 2023. And while that growth did slow down slightly in 2024, sales still increased by 16% year over year. And seeing that growth in horror is kind of interesting for us. With Romantasy, we theorize that people are leaning into those titles for reasons of escapism or needing a break from the harsh realities of real world issues right now. But what if people are leaning into horror in reaction to the same sorts of issues? So in this scenario, maybe these readers don't need books to be a distraction, but maybe they want books to help confront those issues. So to illustrate that, we have this quote from Jen Williams, who is the author of The Hungry Dark. And this was taken from her recent interview with The Guardian. where she said, horror is a genre that tends to ebb and flow with what's going on in the world at large, holding up a dark funfair mirror to real-world horrors. And given that we're in a period of unsettling upheaval, wars, the pandemic, climate change, it's interesting that horror is moving back into the spotlight and even reaching a larger audience. So when we're looking at horror books that readers are buying, in 2024, you can see what those top-selling horror books were. So we have a few ones from 2024, like Confessions of the Dead or How to Sell a Haunted House. And then we also have some backlist titles in there too, like Frankenstein and The Shining. So it's interesting to see that top-selling titles contain so many backlist titles. So from this list, only 4 of the top-selling titles were actually published in 2024. And then here are some of the top horror books checked out from libraries in 2024. And there's a bit of an overlap there as well, like with Confessions of the Dead, How to Sell a Haunted House, House of Leaves, and What Moves the Dead. So yes, there's some interesting things that seem to be happening with horror right now. And this year, with the 2024 BISAC codes, there were actually quite a few horror subheadings that were added, and that included psychological, monsters and creatures, slasher, collections and anthologies, occult and supernatural, and cosmic and eldritch. So those are BISAC codes that we'll definitely be keeping our eye on for 2025. Okay, so now what about horror with younger readers? As you can see, the growth is slightly different here. In 2024, we saw that juvenile horror fiction had the exact same increase as adult horror fiction at 16%, but YA horror, on the other hand, actually went down by 34%. So although it's interesting to note that that YA horror still had more units sold overall than juvenile horror, it did go down. And then in terms of the top selling and circulating juvenile fiction horror titles, as you can see in both sales, in both the retail market and in libraries, we have a lot of Goosebumps series that are dominating in those places. And that's always fun to see because I loved those books when I was a kid.
Hey, let's talk about a different kind of horror now and look at family and parenting, or family and relationships, sorry. In 2024, we saw a 16 or 60% increase in the parenting category of family and relationships, with the biggest increases in the parent and adult child and elder care subcategories. Similar to what we saw with health and fitness book buying trends, here we continue to see the effects of that demographic shift, with many book buyers at a stage in their lives that call for the navigation and care of adult children and aging parents. That is to say, there is an increase in demand for books and resources for older parents and caregivers. The top sellers in the elder care category include 4 Canadian titles. Let's talk about Aging Parents, Parenting Your Parents, The Accidental Caregiver, and The Unexpected Journey of Caring. And here we have titles with the highest library loans in the parenting category, which appear to be geared more towards the parents of young children.
All right, let's talk about cookbooks. So, starting with library data, we saw that some of the most popular cookbook subjects in 2024 were cookbooks with quick and easy recipes, baking cookbooks, vegan cookbooks, health and healing general, and vegetarian cookbooks. So it seems like in the library world, people have been typically drawn to some more traditional cookbooks, whether that's for weeknight cooking or ones that are focused on specific diets. And here you can see some of what those top borrowed titles were. So You have Jamie Oliver's Five Ingredients Mediterranean, for example. And we're also seeing some Ina Garten in there with her books Modern Comfort Food and Go-To Dinners. And what about the retail world? Well, one thing we noticed was that there seems to have been a significant increase in sales for comfort food cookbooks. So while comfort food cookbooks did grow between 2022 and 2023, we can see here that the growth continued very steadily and increased by 97% in 2024. And while comfort food cookbooks increased, we also saw increases in some other comforting subjects like bread in courses and dishes, which increased by 23% year over year, and also pasta within specific ingredients, which increased by 59% year over year. So yes, we can confirm that readers are still breaking bread even in 2024. And here are those top comfort food cookbooks that are driving those sales. We have Tegan Gerard's Half Baked Harvest Quick and Cozy, Ottolenghi Comfort, and then there's also some books that we also saw trending in libraries, like In Mary's Kitchen, and again, Modern Comfort Food. So all of these cookbooks look really great and extremely comforting, and I will definitely be checking these out. And one more thing before we move on from cooking. One other significant cooking subject that saw growth this year was individual chefs and restaurants. And while this subject was actually decreasing previously, 2024 saw a significant increase in the sales of these types of books at 97%. So we asked ourselves, what could possibly be driving those sales? And the answer is the bear effect, I think. Here you can see that the five top titles within the individual chefs, oops, sorry, one sec. But the top titles within the individual chefs and restaurants books were Maddie Matheson books. So not only is Maddie Matheson a beloved Canadian restaurateur, he is also an actor on The Bear. He plays Neil there. So it seems like not only everyone you know is actively watching The Bear, they're actually going out and buying his books to continue that experience.
All right, we will continue our exploration of adult nonfiction and move on now to biography and autobiography. We are also very close to our time, so I'm going to skip a few of these and just go over the highlights. So overall, sales in biography actually went down in 2024, but we did see some pretty big spikes in sales in the music and culinary biography subcategories. So sales of music memoirs were up 53%, and culinary titles up 208%. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little, and you can get a sense of those culinary memoirs that really spiked sales here. And it should come as no surprise that three of the top best-selling titles in the music category of biography are about Miss Americana herself, Taylor Swift. But the real heavy hitters are, of course, the Cher memoir and the stunning visual biography of the Tragically Hip. That increase in music biography sales inspired us to look at the general music category. So we'll take a quick look at that now at the adult and juvenile levels. So here we go. Overall, nonfiction music sales were down a bit from 2023, but there were some large increases in the pop vocal and rock categories, as well as individual composer and musician. Really, looking at these nonfiction subjects is just an excuse to see how far the Swiftie fandom goes. Here we can see, at least among the adult readers, that half of the top selling music books are Taylor related. One of them very much looks like a children's book, which is likely suffering from the wrong BISAC code. It's not clear whether books like this are better suited to the nonfiction music category or the music biography category, which is why we looked at both. Either way, our girl Taylor features prominently in both subjects. And I know I said we'd be looking at music book sales, but we're going to back up just a bit to look at juvenile biographies, which took a 60% sales increase last year. Similar to the adult biographies, it was the music subcategory that increased, in this case, a whopping 172%. So, who are all these kids reading about? That's who. These are just five titles, but Taylor Swift titles actually made up the top nine out of the 10 best-selling books in the category last year. We had way more things to say about Taylor Swift, but unfortunately, we're going to speed things up a little bit. But mainly, we wanted to see if Swift's multi-generational fan base would translate into sales across all top subject levels, so adult and juvenile. And sure enough, they did. And just in case you do want to follow up on some Taylor Swift content, please head over to the BookNet Canada blog and check out Durin Pintana's post exploring the impact of the Eras Tour on book sales in Canada.
Okay, so I'm just gonna mention YA fiction quickly. We talked a little bit about some YA fiction already, but one thing we do want to mention is that we saw that fairy tales and folklore YA titles increased by 29% year over year between 2023 and 2024. And I don't know, could that be another side effect of Taylor Swift, this time in honor of her best album, Folklore? I don't know, maybe. But if you're interested in checking out more YA fairy tales and folklore, we have some titles here for you to reference.
All right. There you have it. Clearly, we can go on for days, and we will amongst ourselves later on. It's literally our job. But we hope this presentation has provided a snapshot of some of 2024's memorable moments in the Canadian book world. And of course, there are so many topics we didn't get to this time. We didn't touch on AI or its impact on book sales, or the rising number of mushroom-themed horror novels, which I personally like to refer to as sporecore, or we really wanted to spend some time looking at the deluxe edition trend for fantasy and romance that really took off this past year, but we'll save that for another day. If there are subject trends you'd like us to cover, please don't hesitate to drop a suggestion in the chat or contact us anytime. But please do check out the BookNet Canada blog, particularly the subject spotlight posts, which cover a huge range of subjects and make use of the most recent data. The blog and link to free research is a fantastic resource for those of you who aren't subscribed to SalesData, but are interested in information similar to what we've presented today.
And as you've probably guessed by now, at BookNet Canada, we love data and we love sharing it with you. Our goal is to help you understand the market, make informed business decisions, and identify trends and growth opportunities. And what better resource for insightful data than our annual report, the Canadian Book Market? So this is a resource that is available for both subscribers and non-subscribers. And the latest edition, which will be released within the next few days, includes top-level consumer data from BookNet's Canadian Book Consumer Survey panel, including insights about book buying, discoverability, purchasing behavior, and more. French-Canadian trade book market sales data from BTLF. It includes insights into the sales of books by Canadian contributors, as well as Canadian-owned publishing houses. And it includes English Canadian trade book market sales data by subject from BNC SalesData. So that's for more than 50 subject categories. And it includes top level data like total value and volume of sales, percent change from the previous year, the subject share of the total market, weekly sales analysis, market shares by volume from the top 10 ranked publishers and distributors, and much more. And then finally, it also includes some circulated titles in Canadian libraries as reported on BNC LibraryData. So if you wanted to be among the first to get notified about the release of CBM, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and we'll drop a link in the chat. So that's everything that we have prepared for you today. But I wonder if there's some questions, if we want to turn to questions that have come in from attendees. And if you
Yes.
have any, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel.
All right. There are a few, and we do have a bit of time to go over them. So I will, oh, here's a good one. Many books have more than one BISAC subject code. So for books with multiple codes, how did you decide which one to go with in your reports? That is a good question and sort of an easy one to answer, mostly because it is very sales data specific. And that is because even though books have several BISAC codes, we only display one in sales data. So that makes our job a lot easier because that's the one we use when we are doing filtered bestseller and market share reports. So hopefully that answers that question. Um, oh, here's a good one. Do you collect information from all libraries in Canada? Lily, do you want to grab this one?
Yeah, so currently we collect library data from libraries across Canada. Um, Currently, we have, I think, 82 library systems that are currently reporting into library data, and we're always adding more to that list. So if you work at a library and you'd like to get your data getting into library data, you can reach out to us at librarydata@booknetcanada.ca.
Great. Here's another good one. If I want to look into a specific subgenre like cozy fantasy or cowboy ranching romances, how would you suggest I go about that? So again, like we mentioned, all of the subject searches on sales data refer to or are based on BISAC subject codes. So when you are going through sales data and going through the subject filters, you could open up the BISAC tree. And if you were to click on romance, that would expand and show you all the subgenres. So there you would find Western, workplace, some of those other genres we mentioned before. And if you're unsure of what the genre you're after is called, an easy way to kind of find that is to look up a book you already know belongs in that genre and just see what the subject is. And then if you search under that subject, that will pull up other similar related titles. So that's one way to kind of get around memorizing all of the different BISAC subject codes. Um, Probably have time for one more. Has there been an increase in books about AI? Again, that's one of the things I mentioned that we didn't get a chance to look at, unfortunately. But maybe, Lily, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I think that it's a good question. So there's a few AI BISAC codes that are under uh, computers, I think, in the BISAC subject category. And like Kalpna said, we did not include that in today's presentation. But uh, I'm, we definitely have seen increases in those categories over the past couple of years. And again, if you are interested in finding that information, you can grab that yourself in sales data by pulling a market share report and plugging those AI BISAC subjects in. I know a lot of people are interested in AI right now, so that would be an interesting topic to keep an eye on. And maybe that would be a good idea for a blog post or even something to talk about in next year's presentation.
Great. I think that's about our time. There are more questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. But again, contact us anytime with questions that you have, and we'd be happy to look into things and get back to you. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Before we go, we'd love it if you could provide feedback on this session. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat. Please take a couple minutes to fill it out. And we'll also be emailing you all a link to a recording of this session. I know a few of you have asked, so you will get that as soon as it's available. To all our attendees, we invite you to keep an eye on the Tech Forum website, bnctechforum.ca, where during the next few weeks, we'll be releasing our yearly product presentations, sharing insights into the latest updates and our plans for the future, equally useful for current and potential users and subscribers. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to you all for attending. Bye.